ans avant le 11 septembre 2001, c'était l'hiver. Anaïs avait 19 ans. Peu importe les ans qui passaient, l'hiver, Anaïs avait toujours 19 ans. It was winter, 10 years before 9/11. Anaïs was 19 years old. No matter how many years went by, Anaïs was always 19 in the winter. These are the first few lines of my translation of the novel Comptez jusqu'à 100, or Count to 100, written by the French-Canadian author Mélanie Gélinas and published in 2008 by the press Québec Amérique. Already in these very first sentences of the novel, there's an obvious link between the individual trauma of rape and the collective trauma of the terrorist attacks that took place in New York and Washington on 9/11. One can see how a sexual assault 10 years prior left enduring emotional scars on the protagonist, Anaïs, just as September 11 marked a turning point in history, not just for Americans, but for people around the world. Today, my aim is to share with you how I came to translate this novel, what techniques I used to overcome the linguistic and cultural gaps inherent to any translation work, and why I consider this particular novel so crucial to understanding and healing past wounds, even more than a decade after our own nation came under attack. I will conclude by letting the novel speak for itself through a reading of a few carefully selected passages. Growing up in small-town Missouri, I was always fascinated with foreign cultures, perhaps in part because my parents regularly sponsored international students from the local university. It was not at all unusual to find myself sitting across the dinner table or playing catch in our backyard with college kids from China, Iran, or Brazil. As a teenager, I took French classes and worked summer jobs to save up money to travel to Switzerland on an exchange program. And of course, once I made it to Europe, I was hooked. I wanted to know more about people from different backgrounds, and communicating with others in a foreign language was a game to me that I found immensely rewarding. So majoring in French was a no-brainer, and I jumped at the opportunity to complete my master's degree in Paris and to continue studying French on the doctoral level at the University of Illinois. For better or for worse, I also wanted to know what people of different countries thought about Americans. After a year of teaching English in Quebec, I decided to write my dissertation on the concept of Américanité, or the Americanness of the contemporary French language novel. In most cases, I found that writers such as Jacques Godbout, Maryse Condé, and Dany Laferrière chose to deconstruct myths of the American dream in order to get in touch with their own cultural identities. This all changed on September 11, 2001, when two airplanes piloted by 19 foreign terrorists slammed into the Pentagon and the World Trade Center, resulting in nearly 3,000 deaths. Immediately afterward, there was an outpouring of sympathy for the victims of the attacks, and French speakers from around the world declared their solidarity with the United States. This solidarity is perhaps best summarized by Jean-Marie Colomboni's famous declaration in Le Monde, "Nous sommes tous Américains," we are all Americans. This pro-American outcry didn't last forever, as relationships between French-speaking Canada and Europe with the United States became strained with the onset of war in Iraq. Politics aside, I still wanted to know what French writers were saying about the United States and how 9/11 impacted Francophone novels around the world. In 2010, I was granted a sabbatical by the Francis Marion Professional Development Committee to study the subject. Considering the physical proximity of Montreal to New York, Quebec was the logical starting place for this research. And here I want to pause and see how much the audience knows about Quebec and 9/11. I'm expecting groans from my students because they know how much I love to give quizzes about anything and everything. Okay, We don't have time to write it down, but just raise your hand, or don't even raise your hand, just shout it out if you know the answer to any of these questions. Okay, question number 1. What is the approximate distance between Florence, South Carolina, and New York City? Does anybody know? I heard 600. Okay, that's very close. 680 miles. Okay, question number 2. What is the distance between Montreal, also pronounced Montreal, and New York City? Anybody know? 420. I heard 420 and less. Okay? 340 miles, so approximately half the distance. So Montreal is twice as close to New York as we are. Okay? Next question. How many South Carolinians died in the World Trade Center towers?
0.
That is correct. None. According to my research, which, there might be some that I don't know, I'm not aware of, but according to my research, there were no South Carolinian victims. Okay? How many Canadians died in the World Trade Center attacks?
100.
I heard 100. Any others? 70? Okay, actually just 24. But how many of these were from Montreal?
All of them.
2, all of them. Let's try 6. Okay, 6 were from Montreal. But that's a pretty big number from one city. Who is New York State's #1 trading partner? Exactly, the province of Quebec. And in the year of 2000, they did about $11 billion of business with the state of New York. So they're a huge trading partner. Okay? How many Québécois, or residents of Quebec, currently live in New York City? 200,000 is close. It's more like 100,000. I'm sure we don't have exact data anyway. But let's just say the population of Florence is about the same population of people from Montreal or other cities in Quebec living in New York. Okay? And let's do the last one here. What website was advertised in a banner which hung from the World Trade Center bridge on September 11, 2001? Does anybody know who I haven't already told? See, I didn't think so. Okay. Close, Quebec Tourism. www.quebecnewyork.com. Most people don't know that. This banner advertised an event that was planned to promote the cultural and economic ties between the two cities. And Quebec's Prime Minister, Jean Chrétien, was scheduled to arrive the very next day and would have been part of the attacks had he come earlier. Luckily, the attacks happened early enough in the morning that the majority of French Canadians, who are kind of known for partying, were still in their hotel rooms and not yet at the venue when the towers were destroyed. So they were saved, for the most part, other than 6. What's that? It's a hard picture to find on the internet. It really is. You have to look at individual footage and freeze a frame because you don't see it very often. Okay, back to my research. I began with a website called the Lower Manhattan Project. This is actually a French language database of fictional treatments of 9/11 in all languages. I discovered several Québécois novels, among them Comptez jusqu'à Zahnd by Mélanie Gélina. In this novel, Gélina relates the story of a young Québécoise woman who survives a violent sexual attack at age 19, but is unable to write or speak of it for 10 years. The terrifying images that she sees on 9/11 triggers the release of her own painful memories. The title, Comptez jusqu'à Zahnd, is derived from the aggressor's orders to count to 100 before leaving the scene of the rape. And after chapter 0, as in ground zero, there are exactly 100 numerically labeled chapters, of which every chapter with a 7, or the word sept in French, has been changed to the French word for September, septembre, as in septembre, 10 septembre, 20 septembre, 30 septembre, etc. This play on words further emphasizes the link between sexual assault and the 9/11 attacks. Comptez jusqu'à Zahnd is at once a work of trauma and of healing. The twin towers of the World Trade Center mirror the double traumas of rape and terrorism, as well as the dualities of the protagonist herself, who literally splits into two separate characters, je and I, who fell silent after the sexual attack, and Anaïs, an imaginary alter ego who speaks and writes in the place of je. 9/11 also radically alters the image of New York. Brutally violated by the hijackers, the city's towers no longer represent a foreign paradise, but rather a fallen structure like the protagonist herself. Unable to mentally process 9/11, nor the promise of her own rape, Anaïs seeks to relive both experiences in a Freudian effort to somehow master them. Her inward journey is a dangerous balancing act, which Gélinas compares to Philippe Petit's infamous high-wire walk between New York's Twin Towers in 1974. Despite the risk, Anaïs must return to her past in order to rediscover her primal cry. To illustrate this point, the author draws on the image of a night moth who surfaces out of the dust in New York and reappears at the end of the novel as a beautiful butterfly when the narrator Je finally finds sexual healing. I have to admit I was blown away when I first read Compter jusqu'à Zahnd. I don't know when I've ever read a novel quite so dramatic nor so daring. The French version is beautifully crafted, yet stimulating on the highest of intellectual levels. Gélinas tackles difficult philosophical questions like the phenomenon of indeterminacy and illustrates what the French-Algerian theorist Jacques Derrida called the possibilité impossible, or impossible possibility, of relating events beyond the threshold of human understanding. Despite the somewhat academic tone, the novel also touched me on a personal level. As a woman, I felt empathy for Anaïs, and as a victim of such a brutal assault. And as an American, I felt a sense of solidarity with a foreign counterpart who experienced the catastrophe of 9/11 with such intensity. The novel seemed to raise more questions than it answered, and I felt quite simply that I had to meet this young author in person. And I do want to point out that she's a very young author who wrote this novel in her late 20s. In March 2010, I traveled to Montreal where I interviewed the famous author Roch Carrier, and I was somewhat impressed that someone who's such a star in Canada, that his works are quoted on their $5 bill, would actually take the time to meet with a literary scholar from small town South Carolina. I don't want to downplay his interview at all, but for the sake of time, I will just say that it is published in full at Francis Marion University's own South Carolina Foreign Language Review, which you can find on web at this site or through Francis Marion University's homepage. The interview with Mélanie Gélinas was something completely different. Let's just say that we hit it off from the start. The interview was scheduled to take up about 1 hour, but in reality it lasted 7 hours and continued over dinner with her fiancé the next evening. It was one of those rare times in life when you meet someone with whom you feel you've known your whole life, a friend who can finish your sentences just as I can finish hers, despite the fact that we live 1,000 miles apart and speak 2 different languages. I wasn't brave enough at the time to ask permission, but I knew right then I would translate her novel. That I needed to do so in honor of Anaïs, who spoke to me through the pages of Compter jusqu'à Zahnd, in honor of all the victims of 9/11 and sex crimes, who never had the opportunity to voice their outrage, those who never had the chance to come back to life or to heal. As the French symbolist poet Paul Verlaine once wrote, "Et tout le reste est littérature." We studied that poem in class. All the rest is writing. Mélanie sent me home with a short story, and I sent her back an English translation without her permission. Before I even asked about translating her novel, she replied in an email, "If you want it, the job is yours." However, I knew that seeing such a work published in English was Melanie's greatest dream, and that I, too, would need to walk a dangerous tightrope between two languages in order to find the right rhythm and the right words to preserve the music of her poetry and to convey the depth of her ideas to a new and foreign audience, you. I was a totally untrained translator, but somehow, at least according to Melanie, I managed to respect her wishes and remain faithful to the essence of her text without abandoning her rhetorical devices nor sacrificing the lyrical qualities of her writing. Yet the translation process inherently presents stumbling blocks. And now I'm going to show you a few of the techniques that I use to overcome gaps between our two cultures and languages. The next two tables illustrate a few common techniques that most translators use when going from one language to another, with some examples from my own work. First, there are techniques that we use when direct or literal translations are possible. Borrowing is when you simply use a word from a foreign language without translating it. It assumes that readers can make sense out of the foreign word without needing to transform it. We do this subconsciously all the time in English when we use the French words like café or résumé, or German words like kindergarten or hamburger. In Count to 100, I borrowed words such as the basic numbers 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, if everybody doesn't already know that. Next, there are calque or loan translations. This is when a phrase is translated word for word into another language. An example is déjeuner, which actually means lunch in French, but literally means to break a fast, which is where we got the English word breakfast. In Count to 100, I used English words such as tongue and language, which are based on the French word langue. Finally, there are literal translations. This is when you take an entire sentence or phrase and translate it into the target language, word for word, preserving the exact same sequence and structure. This is evident in the title, Compter jusqu'à 100, which I preserved exactly as Count to 100. Translating gets a bit trickier when two languages use completely different structures, or when concepts or words in the source language alter the meaning or sound awkward in the target language. This is when we have to use oblique translation techniques. One of these techniques is transposition. This is when you have to change word order. For example, in the very first sentence of the novel, I reversed 9/11 in winter, changing 10 ans avant le 11 septembre 2001, c'était l'hiver, to it was winter, 10 years before 9/11. I just thought that it sounded better. Modulation consists of using a totally different phrase to convey both the same idea in both languages. For instance, I didn't think the French word bourreau, which literally translates to English as torturer, seemed appropriate in English, so I changed the word to attacker, or assailant at sometimes. Reformulation is perhaps the most fun technique because it allows for a lot of creativity. Here you get to express an idea in a brand new way. For example, I could have translated champ de bataille as battlefield, but I felt the phrase combat zone seemed more up-to-date and more directly relatable to the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq and to Ground Zero and 9/11. Adaptation occurs where there's a cultural reference in the original text that doesn't even exist in the target language. For example, I changed meters to feet in order to make the novel more understandable to Americans. Now, if the novel were to be marketed to England or English Canada, of course, meters would make more sense. Finally, one has to use compensation when something simply cannot be translated. So you have to make up for it elsewhere. The classic example of this is the fact that French has two words for you, tu, which is familiar, and the more formal or plural, vous. Although in biblical English, we often see words like thee or thou, modern English only uses you. So one has to think of other ways to indicate formal or plural relationships. To express a formal French vous, I might want to use the English words sir or Mrs. to show respect. If I want to express a plural but informal you, I may want to write all of you all, or even Florence's favorite, y'all, if the context calls for a rural situation, country slang. I ran into this situation with the word viol, which in French means both the musical instrument viola and rape. I thought this imagery was very essential to the point the author was making, so I wanted to make up my own word to preserve it. So I created violation with a slash in the middle, which can be read in two different ways, one as viola and two as violation. All of these techniques are useful, but a good translator also needs an overall method or strategy to make a work work in another language. I drew my inspiration from Canada's most prolific translator, Sheila Fishman, who once said, "To make a successful translation, you must choose books that speak to you, for which you feel an affinity, emotional as well as stylistic." Like Fishman, I believe that you have to find the words the writer would have chosen had she written the same novel in English. However, I would say Count to 100 is even less literal than most of Fishman's works, partly because Mélanie's novel is really like 100 separate poems. I not only had to preserve her meanings, but also her music. Quite simply, I wanted the English novel to be as beautiful as the French original. This brings me to my last point before the readings, which is why you should read Count to 100. I could stress that because this novel has been nominated for 2 prestigious awards in France, which is very unusual for a Québécois author, or that a French radio commentator called it the best novel of 2008, or that scholars at the Lower Manhattan Project consider it one of the best works ever written in any language about 9/11. But I think it runs deeper than that if we look around at us, at who we are, when we grew up, and where we are right this very minute. I think it's safe to say that most, if not all, Americans were deeply impacted by 9/11. It affected our economy, changed the way that we travel, and altered our sense of security, even here in Florence, South Carolina, where you can no longer park directly in front of government buildings or the airport. The terrorist attacks led directly or indirectly to 2 foreign wars and to the loss of lives of some people we may have known, and many, many more whom we never got the chance to know. Most students in our classrooms today were around 8, 9, or 10 years old when 9/11 occurred. During the Clinton years, the biggest thing American youth had to worry about was whether or not the president had fooled around with one of his interns, or if the Y2K bug was going to mess with our PlayStation consoles. Okay, perhaps that's an understatement, but you get my point. The 9/11 generation, as today's students are sometimes called, witnessed during their most formative years televised images of billowing smoke, buildings on fire, people jumping from windows, and bodies covered with ashes over and over again. They saw worry in the faces of their teachers and their parents, and broadcast ceremonies commemorating the loss of firefighters and police officers, the very people who were supposed to keep them safe. Our students grew up under the shadow of terrorism and the pervading idea that the United States was vulnerable to a new attack at any time. Quite simply, in many ways, 9/11 robbed our students of the innocence of their childhood. Then there is the matter of rape. Those same students in our classrooms are the group most likely to encounter the trauma of sexual assault. According to the National Victims Center in Virginia, approximately 1 in 5 adult women have been sexually assaulted at some point in their lives, and almost 700,000 forcible rapes happen in this country alone each year. An estimated 93,000 of these victims are males, and 9,000 are elderly. Regardless of age or gender, rape victims are 13.4 times more likely to become alcoholic, 26 times more likely to abuse drugs, and 4 times more likely to contemplate or attempt suicide. It's a nationwide epidemic, but a silent epidemic that goes mostly unreported. We need to read Count to 100, not only because Melanie breaks this silence and bears witness to perhaps the 2 most catastrophic phenomena of our time, but also because she gets to the heart of both crimes and helps us understand them better. As Derrida would phrase it, Gélinas somehow manages to conceptualize the inconceivable and to speak the unspeakable. More importantly, her novel not only delves into the trauma of rape and 9/11, but also uncovers a path to redemption, forgiveness, and rebirth. The novel is a great example of what the British sociologist and cancer survivor Jackie Stacey calls restorative writing, a narrative that brings meaning to life events which might otherwise be viewed as meaningless. It's a novel that helps both the victim and the reader learn to heal after life throws a curveball, whether it be a highly personal crisis or a traumatic event that shapes an entire generation. The time has come to let the novel speak for itself. The following are a few passages from my translation of Compter jusqu'à 100 by Mélanie Gélinas, Count to 100. And now I'd also like to introduce my colleague and friend, Dr. Kristen Kiley, who, along with my mother, Carol Zahnd, who's here today, have served as invaluable proofreaders of my translation work. And I also want to point out that a proofreader is definitely essential for any translation work, because sometimes you're so close to the French language that you forget how to speak English. Dr. Kiley will also be assisting me with the readings.
Patience. I will tell the story of my death when the only voice I know makes me tell it. I know no other story. When Anais is ready to tell it, this death can take place again. She will not run from it. This time, she will not make me run from it. This time, when I die and my black blood has seeped away, I will not be alone. A reader will accompany me. This morning, in a hotel room, Anais and I are going through with the only death left to face in this life after the worst, the one that writing offers as a gift in the solitude and silence of a new and foreign land, in a land that we alone imagined before September.
Before 9/11, when I wrote, I called myself Anais. Anais was the voice that pushed me to write the story, so I wrote it. I was inventing it without trying to discover its true meaning when the worst happened in Manhattan. Anais was the voice who lent her name to a soul that didn't exist for 10 years. It took an airplane crashing into an emaciated tower in a metropolitan nerve center for this horrible recollection to resurface and strike again. Anais was a state of panic that became a plea. On 9/11, she spent the entire day crying, at her place, alone, absent from herself and from the world, staring at the television.
New York had nourished Anaïs's imagination since childhood. It seemed to her that happiness was to be found there, before this and after this. New York, the heartland of opportunity and collaboration, was bleeding, and its wound, the gaping hole gouged and inflamed by the ruthless attack, suspended the imaginary world, injecting it like a wounded child with a web of nightmarish, ominous images, like a fiction that leaves one hanging. New York, human anthill, had once engendered the poetry that had given Anais her breadth of creativity and inventiveness. Now, New York was sinking into its own porous underground. Writing was suspended inside the pit like a booby trap, as unavoidable and incontrovertible as death from a slashed wrist. Writing, like an ivory pearl hanging by destiny's thread, prepared to give way. The difficulty of writing the truth was as heavy to bear as an ancestral jewel.
This story is difficult to tell. It's more difficult for me to envision myself living than to think about killing myself. Anais tells me to take my time, so I resist. I wait. I write. The reader whom I fear the most is the one who doesn't speak my language. This reader could be you. The attacker didn't speak my language, except when he told me to count to 100. Yet if you are the accomplice in my book, then no language divides us.
I looked on hopelessly as my death was composed in a babble of insults and crazed gibberish. Snapshots of my life projected their depressing story onto my soul's inner screen and shattered my existence to 1,000 pieces.
To dance is also to count, in order to not lose track of the notes nor the intervals of silence that lie between the strokes of a black tailored piano. During the attack, there was only a deep penetration, without the ebb and flow of a dance, without the exchange of a mutual and reciprocal rhythm. It was just a crushing stampede, a heavy pressure that kept on kneading the dough in a singular, painful way, in the same spot, harshly and unilaterally, splitting her body in half into 2 parts.
The attacker was about to finish me off when a thread of voices resuscitated me, like a fishing line extended into the dark void around it. I had difficulty hearing due to all the filth whispered into my left ear. But the images and the memories marched on, and the attacker kept tormenting me in the midst of this bitter projection, forcing me to re-examine all the diabolic illusions tied to my existence. I don't know what harmed me the most, the brutal and burning intrusion of the weapon or the carved-up scenes of my life. In any case, the violence overwhelmed me and summoned me to survive. Its significance, impossible to grasp at the moment, was monstrous.
I remained paralyzed by that event, by that turn of fate, for 10 years. I repeated over and over 1,000 times, "Don't kill me!" Not out of terror, no longer crying or disoriented, but out of sheer determination, imperatively resolute. I repeated, "Don't kill me," like a mantra, like a background noise in a continuous loop, like a lasso awaiting its catch or a noose slowly tightening around the neck of my attacker, severing the thoughts from his actions. Like a magic formula, I knew I had to say that, and that again, all while that took place. Like a memento, a memorandum, or a nota bene, I articulated my refrain, which meant, remember, no matter what, I can't die. Inside, the voice told me, he's going to kill you. Look in his eyes, look at his hand. Listen to his hidden thoughts. He's going to finish you off when he's done. He can't let you leave. He sees that he wouldn't have a chance against you. He senses your resistance. Don't fall for it. See it, spoil his plans. Be smarter than this man. End of story.
I wrote my first novel that way, on my knees in the snow, while counting to 100 slowly and awkwardly, by making myself believe that the present didn't belong to me and that yesterday already belonged to another. I saw tomorrow like an empty screen, a blank page, a flower bed marked by barrenness, as depressing as a piece of paper where nothing is written. I counted softly to myself and occasionally aloud, my sobs punctuated by the memory of a knife's deadly blade, the unleashing of a savage and bestial desire, and the taste of murder. Feeling terror within, I counted for the first time since childhood with the fear of not getting to the end. With every number, I re-examined the film of my pathetic existence, that of a girl of no importance. Each scene belonged to a number, and all were scenes of the worst kind.
Count to 100. The only words that he had spoken in my language. Count. From 0 to 100, and then from 100 back down to 0 again. Count non-stop, just to revive a declining erection and its collapse into chaos, drifting every which way in the most literal wreckage. What did he really mean by that command? You'll see, it will pass the time. You'll see how fast I can thrust my hips 100 times. Don't worry about me, forget about me, 100 times. You'll see, as you suffer these 100 injuries, you'll be the most important thing in my life. And count to 100 what? 100 numbers? 100 days? 100 nothings? Count, perhaps, to the point of no longer feeling anything at all, to the point of no longer existing, until there's an I devoid of a me, until all that remains is a punctured lump of flesh lying in the snow, in which to rub himself, spew himself, ingrain himself, spawn himself, and proclaim himself, in the simplest, most brutal language possible, in a language that the other doesn't even know from the inside.
The attacker was supposed to kill me, but he didn't do it. 10 years later, I'm not alive. I haven't forgiven my attacker for the evil he did to me. A shadow inside me has chosen the life of a recluse. 10 years of asking myself each day why I'm still here, of telling myself that it was a mistake. 10 years of being shocked by this reversal of fortune. My error was to not have seen right away that, in reality, I died that evening in the snow.
The deposition. I found myself in front of that blank page forced upon me just after that. I felt my heartbeat in my temple, my hands, my breast, my loins, my knees, my toes, my fingers, my tongue. My Achilles tendon burned. My throat was on fire. I saw men everywhere I looked, tall, mustached, armed, and invincible. I can still hear my father's voice over my shoulder in that dusty police station, telling me to write it all down, all the details. Write everything that you can. Anais is the voice who told me what to write that story that I was able to write, in a windowless room with nothing but a table and metal chairs. Once again, they forced me to relive that. They forced my hand. This time they demanded the truth. All those men gathered around me, pushed me to do it, in silence as they watched. Not telling the truth was a dangerous exercise, a veritable tightrope performance, an act demanding audacity and the ability to counterbalance oneself. All this in order to preserve the sovereign intimacy of my body, to keep its secret intact, to thwart the human curiosity that impatiently awaited my revelation of the worst. That page, that half-truth, would keep me imprisoned there for the next 10 years.
2001, 1991, 1942. Always the same story. Molten bodies rain down on the city. Absent bodies, never again identifiable. Beings forevermore composed of nothing, of the night, of oblivion. Bodies rain down scorched by jet fuel, annihilated, with no remnants or remains. Blown away in a cloud of white smoke, like the site itself, yet forever dwelling there, becoming its vapors and its vampires. Bodies of memory disappear from the city, but their spirits rise up among the living, carrying with them stories of unspeakable pain. Count the deaths by the thousands of pieces of crushed, boiled, and evaporated flesh. Count. Make a list. Count the survivors. Inventory the damages. The target of an attack is like a bullseye, aimed to kill and blow the victim away. The victim will later be forced to calculate everything in statistics. What time did it happen? What day, please? Even if it was just a few minutes ago, a date is essential to inscribe the crime in history. How far away was your assailant when he hit you on the neck? How long did it last? How many minutes of this? How many minutes of that? How many hours passed between the beginning and the end? Yes, in hours. And how many liters of semen? Yes, liters. Well, milliliters if you prefer. What time was it over? How many fingers did he insert to see if by any chance you experienced any pleasure? What do you think your body temperature was, given the wintry weather and how tightly the crazed beast held you down? In your opinion, how many steps separated you from your grave? Tell us, above all, in figures. Yes, well, perhaps. Come now, young lady, you must tell us everything. It would be like that the rest of my life, to tell or not to tell.
I contemplated throwing myself from a window that winter, to break my entire body and disperse the gash hidden under my breast. My wound of black blood, black ink, the only kind of blood I have. My blood poisoned by a double-sided butterfly.
The wounds were impressive. Anais remembers how startled she was, how she couldn't refrain from gasping 2 nights later when she turned on the lights to use the bathroom. After flushing the toilet without thinking, she removed her gown, which was soaked from a nightmare. Then, stepping onto a tiny stair, she caught a glimpse of herself, of her naked body, in the mirror. Everything inside her began to tremble. It was the very image of a calamity, of a near death. Her pale skin bore the imprints of entire hands, teeth, and jaws. Patches of red formed small, mauve-colored circles between her thighs and on her backside, as if the stranger's thrusts had missed their mark. Her story resonated all over her body. It was corroborated by the canvas of her flesh. She could feel the pain of each injury as it was depicted by her skin. She was like a butterfly, covered in bold colors and markings to frighten enemies away.
I will never forget how a hand can leave such a deep trace on the carbon of one's skin. I will never look away from that image of my body in the mirror. When I see myself naked, I see 2 women, one who has disappeared and another who's still here. And each time a man touches me, I know that he will leave a mark. When I close my eyes, I outline the contours of his every caress. The body is a porous writing case. It bears the etchings of all life's stories.
I endured countless trials for 10 years, burdened by a deafening silence. I spent all that time with a blank page in front of me, waiting for a smile to be born from within. When I witnessed the collapse of one of the twin towers on television, the memory resurfaced. I rediscovered fear itself. Because this was the end, I relived each second of that final human contact more intensely than ever before. My body re-experienced the terrifying rhythms of the encounter, the counting in reverse, the collapse, and all the despair suspended in time. It recalled becoming a hollow pit without a soul, its conscience having evaporated into thin air, leaving nothing behind save a helpless witness to an obscene perforation. At times, my body reminds me of all this. My mind is defenseless against it. If forgetting is an involuntary act, so is remembering.
I live on an island. My continent is an island in the shape of a woman, and New York is my story's forbidden apple. Who am I to talk about New York when I don't even speak the same language as the monster? Who am I to link my story to its destiny, to drink from its wounded breast? Why do I want to inscribe my narrative between the city's own lines? Why does New York keep beckoning me into its heart in order to heal my latent trauma? I reside in a body, but I don't live in it. I no longer want to live in it.
As the time to write draws near, I wear my destiny like an undergarment drenched in blood. Between the lines of the gleaming sheets of paper and within the notebooks darkened by a single bare hand, I read the pain it takes to admit that this crime made me into a woman. It revealed an age-old secret, that of an identity, that of my human gender. In order for a woman to live, she must forgive something that is perhaps impossible to forgive. The condition of being a woman at the mercy of men from the start, since the beginning of time, since creation itself. I want to exist in this world as a woman in my own right, without the help of a man. I want full sovereignty over my desire, over a land that is mine alone. I want to dwell in my desire. I want to experience pleasure again in this body that is not a corpse. I want to abide in my remains and build a monument from its ruins for others who will live after I am gone. I want to inscribe my story of womanhood in the cycle of seasons. One must know my story in order to know my land. I want to inscribe my name on its White House in chalk. I want to learn how to play the images in reverse in order to stop the disaster. I want to live without condemnation. And I want to take a man by storm. I want to give myself to him again, to give him an impossible gift that will last forever.
Desire came back, shattering the ice within, clutching me in the most desperate, starkest, most urgent, and harshest embrace. In the ruins of an old wound in a bedroom in the Intercontinental or elsewhere, perhaps while counting one last time to 100, pleasure returned. I finally abandoned Anais to her struggle and accepted my own fear of abandoning myself to a man whom I didn't know, but whom I had to love once and for all, without loving him, in order to stop losing myself with all the others.
Marcus would see something in her eyes, a great distress. He would want to know how to read that wild look in her eyes, crazed, yet struggling to remain open, despite a sense of bewilderment. Anais would close her eyes and straddle his lap, wrapping herself around him and surrendering her body to his. Impatient and confused, he would ask her what he should do, all the while kissing her on the mouth and unbuttoning her blouse, which would bear a crease directly over her wound. While abandoning herself to desire, she would construct all kinds of metaphors in which life would triumph over death. This was the ultimate combat between the images that she had created and those to which she had been subjected. It was a battle that she would fight to the end. In her nakedness, Anais would understand that experiencing pleasure again was the only way to stop mourning a death that had tossed her into a bottomless abyss. Deep inside, she would feel a portion of her misery crushed into shards and carried off by waves of desire. Her loins entranced by the butterfly-shaped mouth of her pyrotechnist, she would sense the beginning of a pleasure that required total communion with her body, just like the greatest injuries in life. Then, suddenly, she would stop thinking. What is forgiveness? To forgive, I must take the Empire State Building in my hand and use it as a pen to tell how an impossible possibility came to pass in that city where I was reborn. I would write that there is no city more beautiful than one where anything is possible. I would write about New York and the new life that it offered me, intertwining my destiny with that of the millions of phantoms who wander about secretly in its myth, in its gigantic anthill.
One day, I humbly agreed to count to 100 in order to survive. I failed in your language. In mine, I chose to write to the point of delirium, to the point of dying. I did this in order not to fall, in order to not hate humankind, in order to rediscover the hymn and the hymen of life, in order to forgive unconditionally. thank you. And before we go to questions, I'd like it make known that April is both Sexual Assault Awareness Month and Child Abuse Prevention Month, and that there are resources here in the Florence area for both adults and child victims of assault, and the rest of us can help. I want to draw particular attention to the PD Coalition, whose representatives are here today, and the Durant Center for Children. Both of these organizations offer victim assistance and are in need of volunteers and donations of both money and specific items which are listed on this screen.